potential stakeholders. We also looked at a preliminary shopping list of things that would be nice to have if we're thinking about our climate risk assessment. And I've highlighted here in red one particular area where having some knowledge of historic impacts and being able to quantify how floods, heat waves, storms, and other climate-related hazards have impacted operations is actually quite a compelling way to build a case for action. And this is probably the key piece of information that we should be seeking to gather alongside the baseline maps and data sets about site elevation. Now, I think it was Joanne who asked this a really great question about, okay, you mentioned loss of productivity as a potential impact area. How would we go about measuring this? What sorts of approaches are out there? And I promised to go away and look up some of the literature and to come back with some suggestions as to how we might think about productivity losses linked to climate-related hazards. So there's this wonderful global study published in 2019. And again, just to remind you, if later on you click on the blue line, the hyperlink, it will take you straight to the paper. And within that global survey, there were results for the UK that suggest in 2016, so nearly a decade ago, about 3 days a year of productivity are lost due to heat-related factors. And they have quite an interesting calculation here. So there's two components. They're looking at the extent to which a climate hazard causes someone to be absent from work. Perhaps they can't physically get to the site, so they're absent because of that climate aspect, or perhaps they're present and not performing to 100% productivity. So that's the second part of the equation, and those two elements of not being able to access or systems failing at the workplace and the actual impact on the workers are brought together to quantify productivity losses. And the third National Climate Change Risk Assessment has something to say about this too. If you refer to the report and you look at indicator B5, there's some interesting narrative and examples of how previous heat waves have impacted employee productivity. And perhaps the most in-depth study so far that I could find was one commissioned by the Welsh Government, where they looked at the reasons for the loss of productivity under high working temperatures. And right at the top, you can see that 38% of the respondents are saying that it's the heat's impacting my ability to concentrate and to work effectively. 11% of the impact is due to perhaps power outages, or 7% loss of access to sites due to flooding and so forth. So it's quite interesting to look at this, and maybe this gives some food for thought in terms of how we might go about gathering this same sort of information based on questionnaire data at our own institutions. And then finally, just to say that from the Welsh study, it's clear when we compare the educational and the professional, scientific and technical sectors indicated by the red arrow with other sectors, we're not actually the most vulnerable to business impacts from climate change. Not surprisingly, others related to human health, finance, and other services are more vulnerable. So it also gives us that sort of contextual background. Where does education sit alongside these other sectors? So I hope that answers the question and gives some useful follow-up information in terms of one area that might attract the attention of senior managers when we're making the case for acting on climate change. Jenny, I think if you could keep an eye on the chat, I see a questions popped up or comments popped up. If you could just intervene, or anyone else out there who'd like to intervene or make a comment, or just please step in at any point you like.
Yeah,
all right.
I just said thank you, Rob.
Okay, great. Okay, so let's now turn to the homework that was set last week. I did the homework myself. So the first part was to read the short piece on creating the scenarios for a higher education institute, identify the key strategies at your institution, what a vision statement might look like, and were you able to identify 3 academics or other experts at your institution who might be able to offer some useful skills, advice, or insights. So I'm not going to put anyone on the spot, but did anyone have a go at this? What did they learn from the process that they would like to share with the group? Okay, anyone like to make a suggestion or comment in terms of the types of strategies you're able to identify? Were you struggling to find these documents? So perhaps there's a vacuum here in terms of high-level strategies that acknowledge climate risk. So Jenny, is there anything in the chat?
So we have Natalie from University of London. She's on a train but maps 15 policy plans and strategies we put input into.
Oh, right. Okay, 15. Well, that's good. Yeah, thank you. Anyone else?
I couldn't find examples of it in our existing things like sustainability strategy.
Yeah.
But some of the things I was thinking about were in particular things like our master plans for our campuses. And I think particularly when I then read the article, how does that impact, if it's not about growth, if it is about, connecting globally and more virtually, then do we need to build more of that into our master plans?
Yeah, thanks, Claire. The estates and the sustainability strategies that most of our institutions will have are often a useful starting place. So perhaps if I show you what I pulled together for Loughborough. So we have a high-level strategy, vision, and sets of aims and themes and values that shape our 2030 strategy. And you can see that climate change and net zero is one of the 3 corporate themes. So we're off, from my point of view, we're off to a good start. That right there in the heart of the strategy, one of the 3 pillars is climate change. And I highlight here just some text on the right. So aspirations to raise the international profile, to partner with international bodies and agencies is probably something that many of our institutions share. We're looking outward to bring in more international students and research partners and so forth. And I highlight this because I think it also raises some interesting tensions that might exist between how are we going to achieve this greater internationalization whilst also driving down emissions and adapting to climate change. And that's something that each organization will have to navigate, and maybe that's something we could discuss shortly. If we drill down beneath the climate change pillar, the big aim for the university. Then there's other activity areas around research and innovation, student experience, partnerships, and so forth. And what struck me from the point of view looking at Loughborough's strategy is the emphasis is very much on mitigation rather than this resilient net zero. So again, I think that's not atypical. I think many institutions have progressed thinking much further on the mitigation front than on the resilience and the adaptation front. But nonetheless, I hope you can see that each of these sort of areas here under the climate change pillar represents a potential entry point to bring in narrative thinking and ideas about adaptation. That's what perhaps is helpful, is to find these entry points within the existing strategies where we might make useful suggestions. I think it was Claire, you were just saying, you know, that you found some information in your sustainability strategy. Our strategy is being refreshed and due to be published in early 2024. So that again creates an opportunity to really embed some resilient net zero thinking within this broader sustainability strategy, now that we know at Loughborough that this work's underway. And the estates strategy actually has some commentary in there that does refer to risk assessment for all future approvals and developments. So again, that provides us a point of departure. I also then finally, the last bit of the homework, looked around and thought, who are the experts who would be great to bring into these conversations? Some of them are already part of the university net zero team. So we've got experts in passive cooling of buildings, flood simulation, biodiversity, and physical climate risk. So we've got a useful set of skills there to bring to the table. So Claire, did you find anyone at Lincoln who you might be able to connect with particular skills?
Yeah, people I was thinking of were we've got a School of Architecture and Built Environment. I thought they might be quite interesting.
Yeah.
Our estates team as well, in terms of experience already of flooding or other climate-related events. So we've got the School of Environmental Science as well, so thinking there about data and information they may have, or research they may have done already.
Excellent. Yeah. So the architecture guys thinking about smart buildings and landscaping and all of these other things is certainly part of the mix, isn't it? That's great. Okay, so let's.
We also have a comment from Joanne.
Yes. Okay.
She said our Illuminate Education Group Environmental and Sustainability Policy for 2023-2026 has an aim to develop our estates and ways of working and mitigate for the potential adverse consequences of climate change, such as flooding and extreme heat.
Excellent. That sounds like a really nice headline, vision, and statement, which gives you, a clear focal point for the hazards that are of greatest concern, and then that brings you to the steps that we're going to look at today, which is how you evaluate the relative risks and what are the options that you might then table to counter those risks. So thank you for sharing that. That's great. All right, so we're going to move now to step 3 of the climate risk and adaptation framework, thinking about how we assess climate risks and impacts both for the present and future climate. I think it's important to start by saying and recognizing that our individual perceptions of risk vary. And when I talk about this with my own students, I like to show this video clip, and I encourage you to look at it later. It's the scariest rope swing in the world. It really makes your palms sweat when you watch this, but there's some wonderful photography and music that goes with it. But it shows, some people are quite content to hurl themselves off a bungee line into a deep chasm. Others would never consider doing that. So our risk perceptions certainly vary. I've worked in some parts of the world where others might think twice about. So although I can't do the bungee jump, I have different attitudes to risk. So it's important to acknowledge that. And this will certainly apply across the university landscape. Now, I'm guessing that many of us here on the call are familiar with the use of risk frameworks like this, where we recognize that risk is the product of the likelihood of something bad happening and the consequences of the bad thing. And by multiplying these two, they can give us a sense of relative risk. And I'm guessing many of us have used tables like this in other perhaps aspects of our work to rate risk. Excuse me, I'm just going to turn the light on again. There we go. That's net zero in practice. So we can score something that is a very rare hazard, unlikely to happen, perhaps as a 1 or a 2. But if it actually happens, it might have a catastrophic consequence. And so it gets a score of 5 times 1, which gives us a 5. So overall, the risk rating is still low. But the importance of this is that it's proactive, and it's helping us to rate and compare risks in a semi-objective and systematic way. And as we'll see later, we can customize the definition of consequence and the definition of likelihood to meet the local circumstances. And I'll show you how that's done shortly. Now, of course, coming back to the National Climate Change Risk Assessment, the third one, this sort of process has been applied across the UK, and here I'm showing you a slide which identifies the 8 top risks faced by the UK, identified by the last exercise. And these are all quite high level, but I think if we look down the list and you read the little purple text that goes with it for biodiversity, soils, heat, international impacts, and so forth, most, if not all, of these national scale risks to varying degrees are relevant to the educational sector. So we are potentially vulnerable to loss of power supplies. We are potentially vulnerable to heat impacts, loss of biodiversity in and around our facilities, enhanced release of carbon from natural stores on and around our sites. So all of these apply, but of course they're at a national scale. And what we really need to be doing is moving to thinking about the local situation, the local context. And as I think about Loughborough's climate risk exposure, we need to keep an eye on overheating of buildings, student halls of residence, offices and laboratories, and other teaching spaces, lecture theatres. We've got lots of green space, which requires irrigation to make the pitches safe. So vulnerability to drought, vulnerability to windstorms, vulnerability to loss of biodiversity, disrupted local transport networks due to flooding, potential heat and air quality impacts in the Midlands, and disrupted supply chains, disrupted fieldwork, and overseas research activity. So that would probably, fairly capture the risk profile for Loughborough. And you might like to reflect, how many of these might apply at your institution. Perhaps there are extra ones that I haven't thought of. So that's where we're presently at risk, and so we can also think about how those risks might evolve in the future. And I've mentioned the UKCP18 climate change scenarios produced by the Met Office. And again, if you click on the link, it will take you to a simple tool that will allow you to get very high level information about temperature and rainfall changes over land, and you can gather other information for marine environment and so forth. And you can produce these maps, and the different colors highlight the uncertainty from the climate modeling science. Highlights the fact that there are geographic variations in the rate of warming and changes in rainfall. So it's important to consider those uncertainties and also consider the local factors at play. And we can use that information to think about whether the existing risks are likely to go up or down in terms of their likelihood and their consequence. So if we come back to our master table, here you can see I've defined some of these terms. Like likelihood, I've now defined in terms of actual frequencies of occurrence within a given period. So I might like to say I regard a rare event as a climate hazard that occurs only once every 20 years. So that would be quite a potentially severe event if it happened. Through to 5, something that happens almost every year. Perhaps heat waves are almost becoming an annual event. But the important thing is I can think of a hazard, let's say heat, and how often these heat waves have affected Loughborough University, and I can identify my own likelihood scale here to suit the local circumstances. I might also want to quantify the consequence in terms of costs. So what are the damages, the disruption, and other consequences that lead to extra expenditure or loss of equipment or so forth. And again, you can see here I've just got a scale that moves from a few hundred, from hundreds of pounds through to millions of pounds for a major disaster impacting either the people, the assets, or the operations of the university. Well, I think this is a framework like this can also be a really useful point of discussion with our partners. So when we're talking to partners across campus, what do they care about? Is it the pounds? Is it actually days of lost work, going back to the productivity metric? Is it some other metric that best describes the areas of consequence and concern? So we can use a framework like this as a vehicle for opening those conversations to really define a risk matrix that is relevant to our individual institutions. So then the next step is to start to drop some of these hazards onto the risk matrix. And here I've got a hypothetical case for a coastal university which is impacted by drought, heat waves, floods, snowstorms, windstorms, and storm surges, and potential risk of coastal flooding. So I might refer to my record of historic events and find that actually when a drought occurs, it happens roughly twice a decade. There's a few additional costs, perhaps in terms of water bills or such like. So it scores as a relatively minor risk. Conversely, the heat wave is more or less an every other year event and has larger implications. Perhaps critical power systems are knocked out. It's disrupting key activities, research, teaching, reducing productivity. And then right in the bottom right-hand corner, surge is a very rare event, but if it happens, potentially could cause millions of pounds worth of damage to equipment and buildings and disrupted activities. So you might again like to think, well, you know, where might my risk entities sit within this matrix? So that would be based on present occurrence and consequence information gathered locally. And then we can use the information about the future climate projections to think about how these risks might evolve in the future. And you can see that in this hypothetical case, let me see, 4 out of the 6 risks increase in likelihood. So droughts become more frequent, heat waves, floods, and storm surges become more frequent. So they're moving up a likelihood scale. Snowstorm becomes less likely, so it goes down, and windstorm, perhaps the scientific evidence around the projections is too vague or uncertain for us to say how that might change, so we keep that the same. So you can see that in this case, the risk from flooding moves from high to very high. So it's gone from the orange zone into the red zone. So in this particular case, we might say that for this university, the heat wave and the flood risks are probably the ones that we need to concentrate on. And that perhaps comes back to the earlier remark, I think, that was shared about the headline vision of one of our fellow universities around flooding and heat waves. And it might be that this is quite a common outcome. So let's just pause there to reflect on that. And I just open this up for comment or questions, asking you, what do you think your institution's attitude to risk might be? What extreme climate impacts have already happened? How often have these happened in the past? How were these impacts manifested? And how do you think these impacts might change in the future? And overall, putting you on the spot, what might you think is the most at risk asset, group of people, or operation at your institution? So I'll just open that up then. And Jenny, if you could keep an eye on the chat, if anyone else would like to just drop in, raise a question.
I haven't got anything yet. Should we give it a few minutes to see if anyone's just writing or typing something down?
Okay. Maybe I'm assuming that everyone's fairly comfortable with using risk frameworks. Okay, Joanne, thank you.
It was more, can you hear me? Because I've got a headset in and it wasn't working earlier.
Yeah, no, you're good now. Yeah.
It was more, it's quite difficult for people to conceptualize risks and hazards that perhaps they've not experienced. I'm just wondering, have you been able to overlay any other, so on that likelihood and probability table, have you overlaid any other I don't know, the risk of a pandemic, I don't know, the risk of bird flu or something like that? Have you, in order for people to understand the scale of these hazards in comparison to perhaps hazards and risks that people have experienced in the institutions more commonly, have you done any work on overlaying other risks at the institution with these in mind, so that they can kind of see that scale in relation to other things that they might have experienced?
Do you know what? That's never occurred to me, but it's an absolutely brilliant suggestion, and it chimes perfectly with. I mean, I'm guessing that some of you are also aware that we have a national risk matrix, which does include things like pandemics, cyber attack, and things like that. So we could, in theory, refer to the national framework and perhaps drop, cyber attack as an area of key concern for the educational sector. Where would the cyber attack sit? Would really help us to benchmark and sort of understand the relative risk of these climate elements. So I think that's an absolutely brilliant suggestion, and one that I'm going to take away from today. Thanks for that.
I think it's being a geographer, we naturally think of these types of
Yeah.
hazards, and they're in the forefront of our mind. And I think it was about 28 years ago, I did a study looking at public perceptions of a multitude of natural and non-natural risks, and even people that lived in floodplains right next to where the 53 floods were. Climate change and sea level rise was not kind of top on their agenda, and they were actually in. So it might be helpful for people to see them against risks and hazards that are kind of more commonplace and people kind of understand.
That's really great. In fact, I mean, I'll set that as a bit of homework for me as a follow-up for next week. Is I'll look at the National Risk Register and pull out 2 or 3 risks like cyber attack and so forth, which has a high degree of relevance. Not all of them would necessarily be relevant to the educational sector, and I'll try and map them on to take up your suggestion and come back with that next week. Okay. Thanks, Joanne. That's great. Any other comments?
We had a few comments in the chat box.
Yeah.
So, Natalie from University of London said extreme heat for halls of residence, visitors to estates and staff. Also had Claire Scott from Manchester Met. The only campus closures I'm aware of historically linked to the snow in 2010 and a single wind storm event. And in future issues we need to consider include heat waves affecting productivity and more catastrophic weather events. We also have Stephanie from Kingston University. At Kingston University, we are at the start of our journey of developing a climate impact assessment. So the attitude, I would say, is indifferent, as we need further information for key stakeholders to form an opinion. We also have Dan Rees from LSE. Water consumption in our halls of residence and also our sport ground, as in the water stress area in London. We will be looking to design water efficient halls when rebuilt or refurbished. Should we consider the wider impacts of weather issues, e.g. staff, students getting to campus, public transport delays, cancellation? These are all impacts of weather incidents. Oh, there's loads of comments now. I'm just going to quickly try and catch up to all of them.
Excellent. All right. Okay. Well, there's some really great examples there, but I think that just from what's been read out, that further underlines the fact that these risks vary on a highly local level. So I think the universities in the southeast of England and HEI is in the southeast of England facing water scarcity issues. So water resource as an issue, drought as an issue, but there's a wonderful opportunity to align the mitigation agenda by managing hot water. So encouraging reductions in the use of hot water, or more efficient use of hot water to drive down water consumption and both energy. So some great suggestions there. Thanks very much. Okay, conscious of time, let's move on to the step 4, which is now, okay, how do we go about identifying adaptation options? And of course, not every adaptation option is as grand as the Thames Barrier. This is sort of often shown as the iconic realization of adaptation to climate change, protecting London's population and infrastructure from rising sea levels and storm surge, as well as increased river flows. We are going to be thinking about much more humble but nonetheless effective ways of adapting to climate change at our individual institutions. And if we're starting this process, sometimes it's really handy to refer to a checklist or a inventory or a typology of adaptations that has previously been developed. And my personal favorite was produced by Biagini et al. And again, if you click on this link, it will take you to both the paper and this really nice inventory of adaptations across a range of sectors. And I've tried to visualize this typology here in terms of the key categories of action. So there are some around human and social capital, so changing people's behaviors, raising awareness. There's actions around governance, improving management structures and policies, around communicating risks, improving real-time monitoring and decision support systems, around building new infrastructure, perhaps for flood defense, and that could be traditional engineered structures or new green technologies, working with nature, using financial instruments like insurance, and adopting high-end technologies to keep people, property, and operations out of harm's way. And I like a framework like this because when I'm thinking about adaptation from scratch for a particular organization or place, it gives me a framework to ensure that I don't just automatically home in on the engineered solutions at the expense of all the other things. So it reminds us that adaptation is more than just building stuff. It's thinking about people's attitudes. It's about improving access to information, delivering changes, transitions in management practices or standards, codes and designs. So it's much more than just building new infrastructure. And I was curious as to what ChatGPT would say if I said, okay, give me 20 adaptations for HEIs. And what I've got here, I've captured the 13 out of the 20 that came back. Interestingly, ChatGPT didn't or couldn't distinguish between adaptation and mitigation actions. So the 7 that were dropped from the list were to do with reducing emissions. But I think it's a pretty impressive checklist. If we went down here and we were able to do some of the ideas on this list, we'd be going a long way. And you can see it's about incorporating adaptation and risk into our curricula, drawing on our research centres, implementing water saving, improving monitoring, working with local communities, student-led activities, looking at supply chains and responsible use of resources, and preparing emergency response plans. I think this provides a pretty nice list to be working with. But of course, we then have to go deeper in terms of, okay, what advanced technologies might we be advocating? It might be a real-time flood forecasting system at the meter resolution to identify areas that are particularly vulnerable, for example, or focusing in on specific changes in design or retrofit for existing buildings. But I was just curious as to what ChatGPT thought, and quite pleasantly surprised by what came back. Another classic study, which has helped many of us think about adaptation in a practical and a very pragmatic way, was published by Halligat in 2009. And I'm not going to go through all the strategies now. I've just highlighted one, the so-called low regret measures, because all of these strategies, these 5 or 6 strategies, are sensible ways of making progress despite big uncertainty about climate change. The uncertainty is often cited as an obstacle to action, whereas in practice, there's a lot that we can do by increasing safety margins in retrofits or new buildings, for example, implementing measures that are reversible or have short lifetimes so they can be revisited and updated. So there's sensible things we can do. Low regret I single out because these are the types of action that we can implement that will give us benefits now, regardless of the pace and even sometimes the direction of climate change, which may be highly uncertain. And one of my favorite examples of a low regret shopping list was actually produced by the 2007 Pitt Review. You may recall that there was widespread terrible flooding across the nations, and the Pitt Review took made a stock take and gathered together a set of urgent recommendations. And here I've identified 15 recommendations, and all of these I think you could describe as low regret. They make sense to implement today and in the future, regardless of the amount of climate change. So knowing, for example, where your critical infrastructure is, what your critical infrastructure is an action you can take that you're not going to regret. Knowing what and where is at risk. Reviewing your emergency response practices and things like that. Again, it's not something that would be causing any issues or concerns, regardless of the nature of climate change further down the line. But we do have to, on the other hand, be careful about avoiding lock-in and maladaptation. So dealing with the maladaptation side, for example, we might be seeking to green our sites and facilities by planting more trees. But of course, that may be beneficial for cooling spaces, amenity and habitat. But if we choose the wrong species, they may suffer in a drier future, or if we choose the wrong species, they could create other problems such as subsidence around buildings. So we've got to think through what the possible downside might be of the actions we're putting forward. We also need to be mindful of any potential lock-in. So if we are relying on, for example, a coastal sea defense to protect infrastructure, or it may be a levee protecting parts of our sites from flooding, then there's a degree of lock-in that will require the maintenance and the upgrading of that infrastructure to continue to protect the site into the future. That may be fine, it may be perfectly okay, but we need to just be aware of the fact that there's this longer term commitment because we're relying on an existing piece of infrastructure or an existing adaptation. So there again, let's pause to reflect on where we might find the adaptation information. Can you think of any low regret actions that you might be able to already table for your institution? What potential lock-ins and maladaptations might you encounter? Do you know anyone, or where would you turn to get started with your adaptation options list? And what about the adaptations to extreme events or even hazards that have previously been unseen? So again, a range of questions there to provoke a reaction. So Jenny, if you'd like to keep an eye on the chat, and if anyone would like to chip in, please do.
I haven't got any.
Okay. Well, I think just to reiterate what I said is that there are already some really nice lists of adaptation actions that one can refer to, such as the Biogini tables, such as referring to existing climate risk and adaptation plans that are already out there for universities, which may inspire us or give us ideas. So those can be a really useful starting point. But then, of course, a lot of these ideas in terms of the practical actions can be fed to us from personnel and staff working on the ground with our facilities, with our student halls and so forth, to understand what the issues are and what practical steps might be taken. And also, for example, the estate managers too, thinking about how the estate might evolve, might adapt, what new types of building and infrastructure are planned in the future. So again, we can no doubt look around us and see people who can provide some useful suggestions on the adaptation front. So any thoughts?
We have a comment from Charlotte from Nottingham Trent. So one of the easiest low risk adaptation action I've seen is scheduling more regular gutter clearing in the autumn to cope with heavy rainfall events. Yeah,
thanks, Charlotte. That again, that's a great reminder as to why I actually showed these two photos on the left hand side. So it is not particularly glamorous to clear out gutters or drainage systems of debris, but this is really important to ensure that those systems are functioning exactly as they're intended. And there's quite a lot of literature out there actually that just says maybe just increasing the maintenance regime, the frequency of maintenance or checking of infrastructure could be an important low regret adaptation. So thanks, Charlotte. That's a great example, keeping the gutters clear. Anything else? All right then, so let's just wrap it up then. Just to remind ourselves that climate risk assessment is intended to be proactive. So it's helping us to think about what should we really care about, where should we target the resources, what are the key hazards, and as came up in the conversation, how are those climate hazards and the attendant risks, how significant are they relative to other risks that our institutions may be facing. Looking at those risk matrices, I think there's great opportunities to use these to open discussions about what we're going to use to measure the consequence and the likelihood, using locally gathered information on past extremes, maybe even doing a bit of work around some questionnaires to understand impacts of past events on student learning, on staff productivity, the performance of vital systems on and around our sites. And then a key starting point is always to try and identify those low regret actions that we can implement that are going to deliver benefits now and in the future, regardless of the uncertain climate change, and to at all times just step back and think what might be the possible levels of lock-in here, what potential maladaptations might arise from these particular actions. So again, any final thoughts or reflections before I introduce the tasks for next week? Anything that was unclear or you'd like to push back on? Okay, all good. All right then. So, Claire, thank you.
I was just going to say, I think what's been really useful for me today is, I think when I tend to think about adapting to climate change, I think of the big risks and the big issues that we need to plan for as best we can. But I think what's been really useful today is thinking about some of those low regret adaptation options that I think helps to make the case for some of the bigger stuff as well. So yeah, that's been really useful. Thank you. Yeah,
thank you. Also, I think why have I got a picture of my untidy toolbox on the bottom there? That again is to remind me that I think of adaptation as a toolkit. So there's so many things we can dip into, but even I know, and I'm rubbish at DIY, that I'm not going to use a hammer to chop up a piece of wood. So it is about going into the adaptation toolkit and selecting the right mix of options for our individual institutions at this point in time, being mindful of the risks of lock-in and maladaptation. Okay. All right, so for next week, I think it would be really nice, again, if you could look at the next article in the THE Campus series. This should only be about a 5-minute read. And then if you take the blank risk matrix from this presentation, which will be made available to everyone, you can, if you look at slide 19, you might like to customize that or drop your climate hazards onto that. You might, as we discussed earlier, drop some other risks on top to show the comparison. And then thirdly, to come back with a few suggestions of potential adaptation actions that you could take to address the most significant climate risks. So if you are concerned about water outage and scarcity, or overheating of student halls of residence, flood damage to heritage buildings and structures, whatever it might be, please just think of some of the practical adaptations that you could take. So I think that's a good point to pause if there are any final remarks or questions.
Sorry, Jenny.
Stephanie put into the comment, Rob, would you be happy to share your slides from last week's sessions and this week with us? It'll be really handy for reference when completing the homework. Just to answer that, Stephanie, we do a presentation.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, I'm assuming that the slides are made available through the portal where folk are accessing this webinar series. So I'm totally happy to make these slides available. And if you're struggling to obtain them, please just drop me a line and I can send you them. Okay. Anything else? All right. Thanks a lot again for your participation and your input. And I always like to stress that we're all on this learning experience together. I've been provoked to look at things slightly differently in terms of my approach to risk matrices, and I've got some homework to do myself, and we'll come back next week to discuss how we go about rating and prioritizing our various adaptation options. So if we've got 3, 4, 5, 10 options to implement, how do we go about deciding in a rational way which ones to implement first? How do we schedule them in ways that are making sense at our local institutional level? Okay, I think back to you then, Jenny. I think that's a good place to stop.
Thanks, Rob. Thank you all again, and apologies for the late start as well. So if there's no more questions, then we will wrap up. We do have our next training session next week, and that would be the final third part of the training session. So we will be sharing the slides, and the recording will also be on the event website as well. If that's all, then big thank you again, Rob.
Okay, thank you. Thanks everyone for joining and engaging this morning. I'll see you next week, all being well. Bye then.